So the last video talked about using the move command, but it really only talked about it in the context of moving files. And I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that you can also use that move command to move directories. And to do that, let's go ahead and move into this nested directory. And let's say that, actually, I'm going to move back out. Let's say I wanted to move that nested directory from code to documentation. So I'm going to move back into my sandbox, right? I have code and documentation, and I want to move my directory that is code/nested code into documentation. And let's call it nested documentation now, because even though it has some code files in it, right, we're just doing this for an exercise. Go ahead and hit enter, move into that documentation folder, use the ls, right, and I can see that directory has been moved. So when you're moving directories, though, things can get a little messy if there's already a directory of that name there. So let's say that now, right, I'm going to go back to my sandbox. Let's say I wanted to move my nested I wanted to move my directory code into documentation, and I wanted to now call this nested documentation, right? If I were to execute this, if I move over here into documentation, right, and I use ls, right, I see that nested documentation is there, but let's go ahead and see what's inside of it, right? And I can see that because that directory already existed and it was not empty, it actually put my directory code inside of the already existing directory, right? So maybe let's go ahead and just move it back to where it was initially using the move command. We're going to move our nested doc code directory, and we're going to move that back into relatively, we're going to go up one directory into the sandbox. And now if I go back to the sandbox and hit ls, my code directory is back where I started. Right? So when I use this, I want to use the flag T. And what this does is this helps me handle issues like this. And what it's going to do is, if there is not a directory of that name, and here, right, we're going to move the code directory again, and we're going to move it into the documentation, into the nested documentation, right? But I want to name it document nested doc. If that directory doesn't exist, or it does exist but it's empty, it will go ahead and replace it for me. But if it does exist and it's not empty, it's going to go ahead and give me an error. It's going to say, hey, that's an illegal operation. There's already a directory there that has that name, and you use this flag T, so I'm not going to execute that, right? So when you're moving directories, specifically using the move command, I think it's really important to make a best practice out of using this flag, this hyphen capital T, which is short for target, and that will make it so, again, if there is no directory by that name, or there is a directory but it's empty by that name, it will go ahead and replace it. But if there is not or if there is a directory of that name already and it has contents, instead of overwriting it like it would if it was a file, it will just say like, hey, instead of overwriting it or putting your directory inside of it, it will say, hey, you tried to move it where there's already a thing, and I'm not willing to do that. So just a little bit of extra clarity on actually using this move command when we're talking about directories specifically. So now if you go on to the next video, we'll go ahead and talk about the copy command. And then lastly, in this lesson, we'll talk about deleting files using the CLI.